Adrian Pabst Dying by its own hands on the Self-Erosion of Liberalism.
Thank you so much. And I think, as you could tell by my surname, I too have deep roots in Germany. In fact, some of my family lived in Marburg for many, many decades, and I spent a lot of time there as a child. So this is both a homecoming in terms of place. This is certainly a reminder of history, as we are in this extraordinary location here today. And I think place and history are two things that we wouldn't necessarily associate with political theory in general, and I would submit with liberalism in particular. And yet liberalism has been so powerful and influential and, dare I say, seductive, just because I think it has that great universalist aspiration. And what I want to suggest is that the problem with liberalism is precisely its weakness is its strength. Its strength is its weakness. The universalism is a great aspiration, but I think that's also where it falls terribly short. So that's the first introductory remark. The second is, unlike others, I haven't really done my homework, and I have quite shamelessly expanded the scope of my paper to also touch on postliberalism, for which I will not apologize, but I will tell you that as a health warning before I start. So the first part is going to be on why liberalism is in the crisis it's in, and that's quite brief. On the second part is a little longer on the deeper philosophical reasons why liberalism is prone to self-erosion, and then the third on what I take to be post-liberalism. And I will not say a third way or beyond left and right, but I think there are elements that are not purely left or right in the post-liberalism I'm going to try and articulate. Everywhere we look, at every level, political, social, economic, environmental, international, the old order is collapsing and no one knows how to save it. In the personal sphere, the fulfillment of our most intimate needs and human desires for friendship and family, home and belonging, dignity and purpose, beauty and love seems increasingly out of reach. In the public sphere within every nation, there's widespread institutional breakdown, corruption, and degradation of civic life. Between nations, there's growing conflict, sometimes breaking out into war. The old order is not exclusively, but predominantly liberalism. And liberalism cannot save itself because it is dying by its own hand. Freed of all limits after the end of the Cold War, an unshackled liberalism briefly triumphed before succumbing to hubris. This great unraveling has revealed the bankrupt ideal of liberalism itself. The myths of liberalism, once so compelling and apparently humane, have been tested to destruction. The myth of an autonomous individual, the myth of a free market and a sovereign state as pillars of global governance, perpetual progress, whatever temporary setback, and, perhaps most importantly, a worship of liberty as the highest end in itself, rather than the pursuit of mutual flourishing and the common good. In both the economic and the cultural realm, it turned out that individualism, one of the markers of liberalism, by no means the only, cannot of itself generate a substantive order, as Hobbes had wrongly supposed. Instead, the clash of interests leads to ever more inequality and alienation, and the control of populations by increasingly oligarchic and technocratic elites. Inevitably, stronger individuals prevail and exercise their power through increasingly impersonal processes. Thus, one common value which an older liberalism tended to recognize alongside rights, namely the value of utility, now comes to dominate and distort all the others. But in the absence of any consensus to what would even constitute material happiness, never mind other forms of flourishing, what about the symbolic or the spiritual? This engenders a proceduralism, a legalism, that always ensures the triumph of means over ends. The absence of teleology is one of the main reasons why liberal universalism cannot, in the end, properly work. In so doing, by privileging means over ends, contemporary liberalism has created an ever more illiberal society. There are other reasons too, but let's not take away from liberalism's role in this. Parastatal bodies increasingly displace democratic government by imposing goals and best practice, I don't know what that is, which pretend neutrality, but actually advance a political agenda and often foreclose debate. One result of this process, sometimes deliberately sought by ruling elites, is to divert social energies away from any pursuit of shared class interests or common public purpose. If therefore the appearance and operations of liberal democracy persist, then it is only, unfortunately and tragically, in a zombified manner. Hence the collapse of hope and trust in much of mainstream politics today. For the dream of a shining city on the hill has been replaced by the nightmare of survival amongst its ruins. Now, it's not just the case that liberals have simply failed to live up to their ideals. That could be said of any advocate of any ideology or political tradition. In the case of liberalism more specifically, there is a fundamental problem to do with the hagiography of its own tradition, as I think Domenico Losurdo has argued in his very interesting book, Liberalism, A Counter-History. The internal contradictions of liberalism are not just confined to some discrepancy between ideals and reality or theory and practice. Again, that happens for all philosophy and ideology, but I think they extend to its core claims. Defending freedom, autonomy, and self-government, while at the same time failing to universalize these principles. Let me give you some examples. The self-styled liberal John C. Calhoun, writing in the first half of the 19th century, who combined the promotion of individual and state rights with an explicit apology of slavery, an argument that can be traced all the way back to Locke, yes indeed. And even when liberals began to champion the abolition of slavery, as they did, they proceeded to exclude former slaves in more subtle ways, for example, through indentured labor. Likewise, a number of political economists that are arguably in a broader liberal tradition, beginning with Adam Smith, sought to restrict the power of labor to form associations and to self-organize, by essentially dismissing trading and other guilds as something which is a restriction on liberty each and every time. Smith wrongly claimed that they would always in every way engage in price fixing and other competitive measures. Coupled with the Whig Protestant project of imperialism, the liberal pursuit of certain forms of exploitation at home and abroad led to the defense of pauperism in Britain or famine in Ireland. And again, Edmund Burke is one great critic of what happens when you support radical injustice in the name of liberty, as he did with Warren Hastings, East India Company, and so on. But arguably liberalism is in question and in crisis in more fundamental ways than just these contradictions, as a philosophy, as a politics, as a practice, all at once. Let me give you more elements here. And I think it really goes back and comes down to its fundamental philosophical origins. And that is that the broad liberal tradition grew out of late medieval and early modern theories, which assume two things: that the intellect is subordinate to the will, we call that voluntarism, and that universals such as justice are mere mental names ascribed to real things, nominalism. All of that means that when you put voluntarism and nominalism together, you simply deny or fail to acknowledge any shared ontological source of reality. Things are essentially just individual substances bound together by some form of absolute volition. That could be divine volition, or it could be human volition. But that in turn is mirrored in the absolute sovereign power of the individual and the central state. In this conception of being, of existence, and of politics, Machiavelli's Prince and Hobbes's Leviathan are both at once. They are focused on the individual and on the state. There isn't the ontological mediating reality between that. There isn't any of the intermediary institutions ontologically or otherwise. Indeed, Machiavellian statecraft is not soulcraft, but rather the governance of the city based on virtù. And virtù is very different from ancient or biblical notions of virtue. Virtù involves military excellence required to sustain collective independence and is nurtured by a certain controlled sustaining of factional struggle within the city-state, which then serves as a training ground for the combative spirit. Therefore, Machiavelli shares with Hobbes the founding liberal assumption of a given ontological agon, a fundamental violent state of nature out of which order emerges artificially. Liberalism presupposes that both domestic politics and international relations are characterized by an original condition of anarchy, which can only be regulated by the artifice of a formal social contract and a system of absolutely sovereign states. The oscillation between anarchy and artifice is part of the much later debated politically economic question of the relation between military virtue on the one hand and more muted commercial rivalry on the other hand, as Albert Hirschman has, I think, shown in his excellent book. Linked to this is the debate about whether commerce civilizes humans, which is what the liberal social contract theorists and political economists believe, or whether humans are civilized through culture, which in turn enables them to build commercial ties. That is the position taken by thinkers such as Burke and Tocqueville, on which a lot of post liberal thinking draws. Key to these disagreements is the conception of virtue. Whereas in post-liberalism, virtue is the pursuit of goods internal to human activities. So post-liberals talk about good practice. That's already quite ambitious. Best practice, as I said, I have no idea what that means. The liberal tradition builds on Machiavelli's redefinition of virtue as virtù, in the sense of male aggressive prowess. Modern Machiavellian virtue is similar to liberal norms, because what do they share in common? A formal negativity predicated on the latent violence of an assumed initial lack of consensus, that initial agon or anarchy. In turn, the political philosophy of liberalism rests on an anthropology that similarly inverts both ancient and biblical notions. In the state of nature, liberals assume that humans are fundamentally selfish, greedy, distrustful of others, and prone to violence. The only way of limiting human vice is through a combination of Leviathan and Adam Smith's invisible hand of the modern market, with both based on what C.B. Macpherson in his 1962 book called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, right? From Hobbes to Locke, and indeed we can carry on with that genealogy. Since there's no shared ontological source except the individual substances linked by volition in this nominalist voluntarist philosophy, the dominant strands of liberalism redefine human existence as something that belongs to individuals as their own property, echoing here Locke's anthropology of self-possession. But self-ownership requires protection by, you've guessed it, the state. And therefore liberalism effectively grants government not only sovereignty over people within bounded territories, but also power over life itself. That is a very different conception of the state, again, compared with what we find in antiquity or the Middle Ages. For that reason, contemporary liberals redefine the nature of human life in relation to beginning and end of life questions, such as abortion and euthanasia. It's not surprising that these things are now being challenged, and challenged in quite extreme ways. Let's not forget Peter Singer, the ethicist, whether that is the appropriate word or not, I'm not entirely sure, has effectively argued for the killing of severely disabled babies, right? In supposedly noble reasons of reducing suffering. But that is the situation we find ourselves in. Not to mention that there are a number of liberal voices, questioning the biological distinction between men and women. Part of the reason is that 20th century liberalism abandons and denies any notion Part of the reason is that 20th century liberalism abandons and denies any notion of substantive transcendent goods in favor of individual rights secured by the social contract and the pursuit of utility. Again, utility defined as minimizing pain, and maximizing pleasure. That is very different from the older classical liberalism, or indeed the new liberalism that we already heard about earlier today of T.H. Green, J.A. Hobson, and L.T. Hobhouse, only to mention the English, more socially embedded liberalism. That's, of course, the French tradition as well. Contemporary, by contrast, has tended to reduce questions of justice either to matters of legalism or utilitarian calculations, including the jurisprudential paradigm, already mentioned by Patrick a little while ago, and indeed more recently, of course, resort to lawfare. But just because contemporary liberals subordinate judgment to legal and utilitarian standards, they depoliticize the polity to the point where liberalism becomes post or even anti-political by replacing the conception of politics as the self-government of citizens with a conception of politics that amounts to little more than the administration of things. I think that's a term from Lenin. Interesting. Or, more recently, the governance by numbers. All of that through the fusion of central state and free market. As a result, liberal societies have in recent decades witnessed a centralization of power, a concentration of wealth, and a commodification of everyday existence. All of which I think very clearly undermines liberal commitments to equal opportunities, the rule of law, democratic government, and universal human rights. So again, these tensions really do come to the fore. In reality, both liberal philosophy and liberal ideology turn out to be contradictory and self-undermining. This is why liberalism is self-erosing, because the triumph of liberalism, of really existing liberalism, evermore brings about the war of all against all that Hobbes had prophesied, and the idea of man as a self-owning animal that were its presuppositions. But the brief moment of liberal hegemony between roughly 1989 and 2008, the financial crisis, does not thereby prove the universal validity of those assumptions. It's not just because you assume that liberalism will get you out of a war of all against all, or that we are all self-owning animals, that these things are true. Why? Because it's liberalism that's produced in practice the circumstances that it originally assumed in theory. This is why it's circular. This is why it's self-eroding. So, it's also the case, above and beyond that, that increasingly liberal values are now, not clearly practiced by liberals themselves. Let me sum this part up before I move on to the third and final, by saying that arguably liberalism represents the historically contingent, so there was nothing inevitable about this, but it has come about, but ontologically and ethically unnecessary victory of vice over virtue, the triumph of being selfish, greedy, distrustful, and violent over what is mutually beneficial, generous, trustworthy, and involves the power of persuasion. Just as liberal philosophy has redefined humans as fundamentally individual, abstracted from their roots and disembedded from society, so too liberalism in practice has replaced the quest for reciprocal recognition and mutual flourishing with the pursuit of wealth, power, and pleasure, all of which has contributed to the crisis we find ourselves in. Now, post-liberalism, and certainly the post-liberalism that I would champion, is in the first instance the recognition of our post-liberal reality, that the liberal hegemony has ended and that we are now in post-liberal times. But it's not just a descriptive term, it is also normative, and it is the recognition that liberalism, at least its contemporary version, has mutated into something quite intolerant, that's vastly authoritarian in both the political, economic, and the cultural, social spheres. In the second instance, post-liberalism is the argument that liberalism alone was never sufficient. The liberal primacy of the individual was always destined to evolve into something that essentially is about the inviolability of self-assertion. But once you have that principle in place, order can only be maintained in arbitrary and often coercive ways, albeit masked by liberal legalism and proceduralism. Therefore, post-liberalism argues in the third instance that respect for liberty must be balanced by a shared pursuit of economic justice and the common good defined as the reconciliation of estranged interests, capital and labor, young and old, religious and secular, and all of the rival interests we can think of. Only on this basis can respect for reasoned argument and democratic debate be restored. Now, if we are serious about peace and consensus, and these again are noble liberal ideals, then we require some form of agreement, not eternally, not fixed, not dogmatically imposed, but we need some kind of agreement on some of the ends we're pursuing. We cannot leave out teleology. But because such an agreement is never going to be complete and will never last eternally, because we are all mortal and limited and finite, then the formal allowance of agreeing to differ, which is also an important liberal notion, will always have an important place in the constitutional order. Politics is also about conflict, and we're not going to have that agreement each and every time. So because it's important to maintain that ability of agreeing to disagree, post-liberalism is actually not anti-liberal. And it's not anti-liberal in three ways. First, it's committed to renewing the liberal in an older sense of the generous, the tolerant, the civil. Right? Now, that was illustrated in the social order of the post-war era, when liberalism was still much more embedded in inherited networks of associated corporate bodies and more substantive ethical cultures, of course limited, of course imperfect. But they were grounded in both a religious and a civic inheritance that people could recognize. The New Deal in the United States, the post-war settlements in Europe, were not simply a reassertion of formal liberal democracy, though they were that too, against totalitarianism. They also involved explicit covenants between government, business, trade unions, churches, and other cultural bodies at both national and international levels. This admirable consensus, certainly shaped by liberalism, ultimately collapsed perhaps because some elites did not remain sufficiently aware of its corporist character and its expression of this mixed civic and religious settlement, or the last Christian settlement, as Samuel Moyn has called it. The postliberalism really thinks that, there is a way in which, liberalism can contribute to a settlement, but not on purely hegemonic terms. It has its role to play, but it needs to be embedded in something thicker than just formal rule or pursuit of utility. Secondly, postliberalism is committed to renewing the principles of liberality, such as free speech, free association, and free religious practice. These, by the way, were never the monopoly of liberalism, because liberalism didn't invent them. They go back to antiquity and the Middle Ages. The problem is that mere liberalism ends up threatening free debate, because freedom of speech assumes the possibility of a shared quest for objective, ethical, and even some form of metaphysical truth, which liberalism on its own either ignores or denies. And you cannot say that truth is simply a matter of subjective opinion and private preference, or else debate becomes ultimately pointless or increasingly offensive. Universities are in danger of ceasing to be places of vigorous discussion and have instead, in many cases, become theatres for protecting individuals from being exposed to any challenges to their self-understanding. The third respect in which post-liberalism is not anti-liberal is in relation to questions of policing and punishment. You might think this is quite a particular example, but I think it illustrates a wider point. Because to base punishment on either deterrent or retribution alone is to embrace the modern liberal reduction of human life to a calculation of utility and rights. Post-liberalism is instead committed to a politics whose ultimate aim is to make people more virtuous, in the sense of genuinely happy and flourishing. And the purpose of punishment, as Aristotle already argued, can therefore only be at once economic restitution to victims and the rehabilitation of the offender. Justice, in a substantive, not a merely procedural sense, is inherently restorative, else it's simply vengeance. A humanist attitude, that could be more inspired by more secular values or by religious beliefs, a humanist attitude towards punishment must nevertheless be balanced by continuously effective policing with the support of the community. There's nothing genuinely radical about the fomenting of anarchy followed by coercive control, and that is again the oscillation we see too much today. We create the conditions for anarchy and then we go in really hard, and that doesn't seem to be conducive to flourishing. Currently we have the opposite combination of ever longer prison sentences on the one hand, based on either utility or rights, with increasingly ineffective policing and the failure to catch the perpetrators of serious crimes on the other hand. Like all of our institutions, policing has succumbed to impersonal bureaucratization. As a result, there are fewer police on the beat and more police filling in pointless forms. Thus, at the heart of post-liberalism is not the denial of the importance of personal freedom, but rather the primacy of interpersonal relations over impersonal forces. This is what it often comes down to. The real pivot is not left and right or state and market. It's about, are you on the side of impersonal forces or are you on the side of interpersonal forces that of course require institutions and require shared polity to make it work? I'll now conclude. Elsewhere, I've written about three faces of post-liberalism: national conservatism, Catholic integralism, and a more personalist or communitarian pluralism. My argument is that the first, national conservatism, is both anti-liberal in a cultural, social sense and ultra-liberal in an economic sense, and therefore ultimately not post-liberal at all. To cut a long story short, and at the risk of somewhat caricaturing our NatCon friends, and I have NatCon friends too, they are essentially market nationalists. Meanwhile, the second phase of post-liberalism, national integralism, combines, I think, an important post-liberal political economy that is still being worked out and developed with a, I suppose, cultural and political vision that is ultimately privileging the nation state and confessional religion. There's much to be said, I think, for the former. In my mind, a little less for the latter, because I think the nation state still requires forms of international ties. And I think confessional religion, to me, strikes me not just unrealistic, that's not the problem, but it strikes me as a rather modern way of viewing the relations between state and church, but that's a longer debate. The third phase is more truly post-liberal in my mind because it offers constructive alternatives to contemporary liberalisms that are anchored in three or four important things. I will not go into them, I will just mention them. Personalism, that is a important ontological and ethical outlook. Pluralism, corporatism, and internationalism. If I had more time, I would develop them, but I've spoken enough, so thank you all for your attention.